famous poem by Horace, colloquially known as the Cleopatra Ode, in which he describes Cleopatra's decision to commit suicide rather than surrender to the Romans and be paraded through Rome in a triumph. I'm going to term this an ideological suicide being an instance of choosing death rather than compromising your ideals, and I'm going to argue in the framework of Kantian ethics that ideological suicides are permissible. Now I'm going to start by setting out the fundamental principle of Kantian ethics, which is the formula of universal law. Now the formula of universal law says to act only according to a maxim that you can at the same time will as a universal law. Now a maxim is a combination of action and purpose, and one of the examples I like that Kant uses to illustrate how the FUL works is he says, imagine I have a maxim about lying promises, right? I'm going to make a lying promise in order to get money. Suppose I say, well, I'm going to pay you back, at some point in the future, but I don't intend to. Okay, and then we ask ourselves, well, what would happen if this was the general principle on which people acted? They said, I'm going to make a lying promise in order to get money. Well, in this world, promises would not be trustworthy, right? Because you would get lying promises all the time. You would never know when you were actually going to get paid back. In fact, in almost every case, you wouldn't get paid back. And so in the world where your maxim becomes a universal law, it is impossible to successfully act on your maxim. You can attempt to make a lying promise, but it's never actually going to work. Okay, there's another fundamental principle that Kant posits, which is the formula of humanity. And the formula of humanity says to never treat the humanity in yourself or in another person as a mere means to an end. Now, what does Kant mean by mere means to an end? This is a bit vague. I'm going to break it down. I think there are two things that are like good candidates for what this might mean. One of them is you treat someone as a mere means to an end, just in case you transact with them in such a way that you show no regard to their interests. Another one is you treat someone as a mere means to an end, just in case you override their free choice. Now, I'm going to focus on this second interpretation, because I think for our purposes it's more interesting. And the thing about the second interpretation, okay, never override your own free choice or the free choice of another. Well, that first part of it, I think that's a bit vacuous, right? What does it mean to override your own free choice? I think that would have to be, to at the same time will something to be the case and act in order to make it the case, and then also will the other thing and act against yourself. Maybe there's some way that you could do this accidentally, but I don't think you could do both of these things at the same time. So I'm going to try to create an alternate argument for the formula of humanity that preserves this asymmetry between yourself and others, where you're not permitted to treat others as a mere means to an end, but you are permitted to treat yourself as a mere means to an end, or rather, what it means to treat yourself as a mere means to an end is just something you can't do. Now, in addition to it being sort of psychologically impossible that you override your own free choice, I'm also going to argue that there's a certain attitude you have to take towards your own free choice, and this is the attitude of respect. Now, for one person to respect the free choice of another person, I think this involves two things. One of them is if I'm committed to respecting the free choice of another person, I'm committed to not overriding it, or at least not overriding it without good reason, right? We can imagine a case where I have overwhelming reason, but I'm not gonna override someone's free choice just because I feel like it if I respect their free choice. Another component of it is that when you respect the free choice of another person, you consider it good in some sense that they get the object of their free choice. Now, you don't have to consider it good absolutely, right? All things considered, it may be better that things go a different way, but you have to think there is something good about them getting the object of their free choice. Okay, now I want us to consider two maxims. One maxim is, I will refrain from overriding my own free choice in order to be consistent with my respect for that. Now, this maxim, I'm going to argue, is a maxim that any rational agent has to take on, right? If it's psychologically impossible for you to override your own free choice, and if furthermore you are committed to respect for your own free choice, you're committed to this maxim basically by default. Now, there's a second maxim which I'll present for consideration, which is when I can further my own goals, I will override the free choices of others. So I'm going to draw some circles and squares on the board. The circle represents me. The arrow is this relationship of overriding free choice. I'm going to argue that this just doesn't go, right? Our first maxim rules this out. Now I'm going to draw a square, right, which is another person. Our second maxim permits this, and it also permits this, right? I can override another person's free choice, they can override mine. Now, what's going on when I will that another person be able to override my free choice for their own reasons? Well, from my perspective, right, it would be one thing if I willed that they override my free choice when they consider it good, but simply to further their interests, right? Well, from my perspective, that's arbitrary, right? The interests of other people's, what sorts of things they want in their life, people could want anything. And I'm going to argue that willing that your free choice be overridden for an arbitrary reason is not consistent with respecting your own free choice. It's not consistent with considering it good that you get what you freely choose. So this is equivalent to this, and we've ruled out this. So if our first maxim fails, then our second maxim fails as well. That's basically my argument, and this creates a version of the formula of humanity on which I can't kill another person, because killing another person is inconsistent with respect for their free choice, at least insofar as they don't want me to kill them, right, which is generally the case. But when I think about the prospect of killing myself, well, if I make a free choice to kill myself, right, this is very much consistent with respecting the value of my own free choice. Now, the last thing I want to, that's my argument as it stands, but the last thing I want to do is sort of make a more intuitive case for why the Kantian should accept this conclusion, which is basically that one thing Kantians think is really important is our ability to choose our own ends, right? To decide, like, I think this thing is more valuable than this thing, and so I'm going to pursue it. And I think most people will find this intuitively appealing. And in the case of Cleopatra, where she says, I'm going to preserve my own dignity rather than survive, I think what we should consider her to be doing is choosing one end, the preservation of her dignity, over the totality of all the other ends that she may choose in the remainder of her natural life, right? So this is quite an extreme way to value your own dignity, right? You have to think quite a lot of it. But just to say this one thing is so much more valuable to me than all these other things, such that I'm willing to make a great sacrifice in order to have this thing, that I think is the sort of decision that a Kantian should want agents to be able to make. I'm now ready to take questions.
Thank you. Can we start with just, that was a very complex argument with a lot of moving parts. Simplify it.
Sure, yeah, so if I wanted to
So 3 steps, if you can.
3 steps, okay, I'll try my best. So I'm gonna,
I'll allow 5.
I wanted to put it very simply, okay, I'd start with this, right? Act only in the way that you could will everyone else to act, right? That's sort of where we're starting. We're taking this as a basic principle of moral action. Then we'd say, okay, if I consider, right, what sorts of principles would I endorse for everyone to act on, we have this principle of I will kill another person, override their free choice, right, when it serves my interests. And I have this principle, I will kill myself when this is most consistent with upholding the things that I value, or rather, most consistent with the value of the things that I consider valuable. Okay, these 2 policies, the first one, I would not want everyone to act on that principle. I would not reflectively endorse it, right? So I shouldn't go kill other people. The second one, I would reflectively endorse that. If there was something that I considered so valuable that I wanted to kill myself in order to be consistent with its value, right? I would want to say, yeah, I should be able to do that, and so I endorse it as a principle. And if the first principle doesn't go, but the second principle does, right? That gets us a situation where it's impermissible for me to kill other people, but it is permissible for me to kill myself.
I'm a little unclear as to the role in your argument played by the fact that Cleopatra sort of is wanting to preserve her own dignity or something like that. I mean, suppose she just hates life. Is that going to be a problem? Because at the one point when you said that you'd completed your argument, you said that people having the free choice to kill themselves is something that we could will to be a universal maxim. So that seems to float free of their reasons.
Yeah. So there's a reason I chose Cleopatra's case in particular, which is because I think an ideological suicide is a case of a person who is like probably quite clear-minded about what they value, right? Perhaps we can imagine Cleopatra having a moment to sort of sit and think about what do I really prefer. Whereas in cases where people choose to kill themselves, say, to relieve anguish, we might think that when the anguish is sufficiently intense, it sort of warps their ability to weight how much they value certain things. So I do weight the absence of pain quite heavily, but when I think about, if I could live another 1,000 years, right, but I had to endure a moment of just incredibly extreme agony before that, right, or 10 minutes worth or something like that, When I'm sort of in a clear-headed frame of mind, I would say, okay, I'll take that deal, I'll endure the agony. However, if I'm actually in that moment of agony, right, the agony in the moment may seem to me so extreme that I'll say, just get me out of this no matter what it takes, right? So I'm not really rationally considering how much I value the different outcomes that are available to me, and that I think is an important distinction, or at least a probable distinction between most cases of suicide because of anguish and most cases of what I term an ideological suicide.
Again, I'm a little hazy on this because you presented the conclusion of your argument as being that by Kantian principles one has the free choice to kill oneself. That doesn't talk about your mental state at the time or anything like that.
Yeah, so let me say a little bit more. So in Kantian ethics, right, when we're evaluating how a person acts, we don't just evaluate the action, we evaluate the maxim. And we want to know if this is a maxim you would reflectively endorse, right? So when we think about the maxim of like, okay, I will kill myself when I'm in extreme anguish, right? And the anguish is just overwhelming in order to relieve my anguish. I'm not sure if this is a maxim that we would reflectively endorse. I certainly wouldn't, right? Because I can imagine wanting to make that decision in a position of extreme anguish, but thinking in any other position, I'm glad I was able to endure the anguish and survive. On the other hand, when I'm considering, okay, I have all these worldly goals that I might pursue on the one hand, and I have this ideal that's incredibly important to me on the other hand, and preserving the value of the ideal or preserving my commitment to it requires the sacrifice of my life and all the worldly goals that go along with it, I think that's a maxim we would reflexively endorse. So what I want to say, right, is that the Kantian shouldn't just be considering the action of killing oneself. The Kantian should be considering the combination of action and reasoning. So I think I want to persistify my argument and say it's not just killing yourself, right? It's killing yourself because it's the only way to preserve your commitment to something that you value an incredible amount.
But the person that's killing themselves to alleviate anguish, presumably they are valuing something to a very high degree, which is a life without anguish.
Yes, but in that situation, right, again, if I'm thinking about in the abstract, would I endorse killing myself in that situation? Well, I'm going to say no, because I'm going to think that when I'm in that situation, the anguish will be sufficiently intense that it will warp my understanding of how much I value other things in my life, right? And I'm very much going to want to continue, in the abstract when I'm considering the principles I would endorse, I'm very much going to want to endure the anguish so that I can continue living my life and have access to all these other goods.
So just go back to the original principle then. So act only according to a maxim which you can will to be a universal law. Is that act only according to a maxim which you can will sort of at such a time when your reasoning is unencumbered or whatever like that to be a universal law, or is it act only according to a maxim which you can will at the time of action to be a universal? I mean, just put in the temporal qualifications here.
Yeah. So it's going to be a maxim that you can rationally will to be a universal law. I'm about to get to that.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be a circumstance where you're able to step back from the sum of your desires and analyze them all and reflect on how you weight them relative to each other. So if I'm just sitting in my armchair at home, it seems I don't actually have an armchair, but if I'm sitting in my armchair at home, it seems I'm quite capable of doing that. It seems like I'm capable of saying, okay, in this circumstance, there would be two goods available to me, and maybe I prefer this one. But when I'm actually in a situation of extreme anguish, it doesn't seem like I'm capable, or at least I might not be capable in the most probable version of that situation, of sort of stepping back and analyzing my desires in this rational way.
So what can I do then when I'm in anguish? If I'm not able to reason about my moral actions in a permissible way, according to a Kantian, what does a Kantian do when they're in anguish?
Well, so the Kantian, when they're in anguish, right, unfortunately, you might find yourself in a situation of anguish as a Kantian where you are going to end up, right, taking the easy way out, right, because you're not able to perform this action of stepping back. But I think if we have a given Kantian who has reflected on this issue beforehand and has sort of tried to plot out, like, okay, if I was in this position, what principle would I endorse, right? That person may be able to sort of have the principle that they've endorsed for action operating in the background as they're making a decision. So even without taking that action of stepping back and evaluating my desires and my reasons in this abstract way, I may still have previously decided on a principle through that method of reasoning, and I can sort of act on that principle like in the course of habit, right? Something like that. So if I tried to make a habit of acting on principles that, like, in my more reflective moments I would rationally endorse, it seems like that's going to create good outcomes in positions where I don't have that luxury.
So basically, if you're a Kantian and you're feeling anguished, don't try and do anything new.
I think that would be a good heuristic.
Do the
yeah.
things you're used to doing.
I think that would be a good heuristic, yeah. Now, perhaps you could become accustomed to the anguish, right? If you were anguished for a sufficiently long period of time, and then you could sort of cultivate the ability to do this kind of abstraction even in a position of extreme anguish. But I think, yeah, it would be, I mean, by anyone's lights, I think it would be a good principle, right? When you're in a position that sort of hinders your ability to step back from your desires and say to yourself, what do I really value? Like, being cautious in that position, I think, is a principle that we should endorse.
So you've argued that what you call ideological suicide is permissible if you're a Kantian, or maybe not even permissible, it's like demanded? Or?
Well, it's up, I think, when we talk about this stepping back from your desires, right, and deciding I choose this thing over this thing, right, there are going to be some people who, for the ideology in question, right, the way Horace frames it in the poem, Cleopatra's dignity was the most important thing to her, right, and so she was willing to choose it over everything else she might pursue. Now, there could be a case, right, where my dignity or my commitment to a given ideology is really, really important to me, but it's not as important as everything else I might decide to choose in my life. Right, so it might be the rational thing to do for a person who values dignity as much as Cleopatra does, but there could be many people, right, who might consider ideological suicide and then say, no, actually, this isn't worth it to me given my desires.
So argue the other side of it now. What are the best arguments for saying that kind of suicide is impermissible?
Right, so I think the best argument, or at least the argument that I find most compelling, is going to be the classical Kantian argument, which is you're going to reflect on the value of your free choice, and you're going to say, well, look, this free choice, my ability to look at my ends and say, this is what I'll pick over this, that is the condition for sort of all the value I experience in the world, right? This is sort of the way Kant starts his classic argument for the formula of humanity. And the inference he draws from that is, look, if you have conditional value, it has to be conditional on something. There has to be some kind of unconditional absolute value. And he says, as far as our experience goes, our ability to choose the ends we're going to pursue is that absolute value. Now, when you consider something absolutely valuable, right, it's not possible for you to act against it, not rationally possible, that is. Of course, you could do it. And if your free choice is such a thing, right, to commit suicide and take from yourself the ability to make free choices in the future is going to be to act against something that's of absolute value.
Did I get you right there, that you think that something which is a precondition for value must itself have a value, that must have an absolute value? Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So the classic way this argument is going to go is, right, I look out to the world, right, any given thing I value, say a bag of chips, okay, I think to myself,
Glass of wine?
glass of wine, absolutely, yeah. If but suppose I'm choosing between a red wine and a white wine, right? And what I'm ultimately going to choose is going to be, or rather, my choice is going to reveal what I value more under ordinary circumstances, right? So it seems like the value of the red wine versus the white wine, it's conditional on what I choose. Now the question is, in a circumstance where all value is conditional on what I choose, we have to think about, okay, but where does value come from in the first place, right? It can't be that everything has value, but somehow well, I guess it could be this way, but it would be very strange that everything has value, but only when I choose something am I aware of the inherent value that it has, right? Because if I've chosen something at one point, right, I may say this is valuable, but then I could choose some other thing. I could even decide that the thing I once valued isn't valuable anymore, and that would be very strange if I were detecting some inherent value. So basically what the Kantian is going to say is, from a practical perspective, we look at, okay, where does the value come from? And we say it comes from our choice, right? And the idea is our choice is the source of value. As the source of value, it's going to have value itself, right? And that value is going to be unconditional.
Why isn't my palate one of the conditions for me accessing the value of the wine? And if so, doesn't that make the palate more valuable than the wine?
Yes, so the palate, well actually I think there is a good argument to be made that the palate is at least as valuable as the wine, right? Because if you didn't have the palate, your enjoyment of the wine, which is presumably where its value comes from, would not be possible. So at least,
So if it weren't for my parents, I wouldn't be able to do this either because they introduced me to wine at a legal but early age. So my parents are more valuable than the wine as well.
I mean,
So
again,
the things that are conditions for the experience of the value automatically inherit the value of the thing they are conditions for.
I think it may not be, you know, that in every case the thing that's the precondition for the value is absolutely valuable, right? I think Kant is going to say that that comes down to our choice because our choice is sort of the most fundamental thing in this hierarchy of values. But yeah, I would say in any case, right, where you have something that's valuable and you have something else that's sort of explanatorily prior such that like without that you would not be able to have the experience of value, right? If you value the thing in question, you probably should value all the stuff that made it possible for you to experience that value. I'm gonna affirm that.
Thank you.
That's time.
That's it. Cool.